Cool. Maybe like I think it could be interesting actually. I'm curious what your thoughts were about LizCon and like the experience in Lisbon because we both saw each other in person there, and it was very fun, sort of like being the yeah, kind of like being the two leftists a bit amongst the crowd and like sort of making similar observations about what we were saying. How was your experience there?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I think like um well I didn't stay for LizCon. I was only in there for in and out for Taoist, but I think for that I kind of share, your take on it a bit, which is that like it's an interesting space to be in because a lot of folks are there ostensibly because they're into a lot of the horizontal and sort of other forms of organization that DAOs bring. They're into sort of blazing a trail for a new world, so to speak, right? They talk about a lot, but they are butting up against the edge of a lot of very radical ideas and not really owning the terms. Which, to be clear for me, I don't actually care if you come in and self-identify or not as some particular radical school of thought. You coming from anarchism, I really only care about your actions for the most part, right? It's this is not as Graeber used to say, like, don't call me the anarchist anthropologist because I see some as anarchism is something you do, not something you are, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that is a super important point that people need to think about
Yeah,
in these type of like debates about identity,
exactly.
particular intra left identities, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, I saw it as a place of a lot of promise. I thought it's very interesting in that front because you have all these people who are ostensibly running around going like, um, I'm quoting a few people here. I'm not gonna say who they are just in case they didn't feel like they were saying it to be quoted on a podcast later. But I heard stuff like we need to guarantee access to the basic necessities of life for everybody. Like, nice, right? Like it's been a lot of people been saying that for 300 or 400 years, right? Like that's great. We need well, the future of public goods is one where we have a where we manage a public commons, right? And I'm like, man, does this person know about the diggers and the levelers and the 13th and 14th century enclosure movements? Probably not. But it doesn't matter if they do or don't. It's more that like when I trace the lineage of I'm not going to say we currently live in hell necessarily. I'm lucky as hell. I don't live in hell, but like hell definitely exists on Earth for the vast majority of people, right? And so and that origination of that hell in a lot of ways points back to I'm not gonna sorry we all I only made it like 3 minutes into this podcast before I shit on England, right? That's funny, right? Like this
That's
must
totally
be a new
allowed.
record for me, like 3.5 minutes. But anyway, you can trace that lineage back to like the commons, the enclosure of the commons movements, right? When around the time when people said, yo, we got to get these peasants off this land. We got to create artificial scarcity. We got to make these people work for a living because people were comfortable as hell for that, right? It's not like they lived in paradise. That's not what I'm saying, right? It's more that like they didn't have the yoke. They didn't have to, what is it? Diggers of earth and carriers of water is what they is one of the things they said, or something like that. I'm butchering it, but these things didn't exist. So when you're at a thing like Taoist and you're hearing people say this, it's like they have already got past that point of like the many-headed hydra and like you know maybe some of the other things that pop up in our sphere. They're kind of internalized that this is wrong and we can do better, and that's nice, right? I don't need you to know your lineage, but if you're going to be working on these kinds of things, I'm right there with you, right? Let's build that together, right? And so that was my take, right? It's kind of strange to see everyone say it, and then when you're like, I did this a couple times, I was like, that's that thing you just said is exactly what we've been saying for a long time over here in X camp, right? You're like, oh, really? Wow, I didn't know
Right.
that. Ooh, I don't know about that. It's pretty funny. The terms.
Yeah, which to me it felt really like they would say things that would like really brush up close to quite radical political thoughts, but they clearly did not know that. Like they kind of discovered it on their own,
Hmm.
which is why like I think it is really interesting to sort of to provide them with that extra bit of knowledge so that they know like someone's already thought about this like 200 years ago. And, this is whole history of thought and people doing actions because of that thought that you can learn from. And that's sort of where I think a lot of the huge opportunity that a lot of people on the left are sort of missing out on is that as much as you may think that the space is filled with crypto bros, I really hate that term, but like if you were to just if you were to get into conversation like a good nice like non-argumentative discussion and conversation with these people, you could probably teach them a lot and they would listen to you. Very surprising, like super surprisingly. Like for all their flaws, I think a lot of these same people are also willing to listen, which I cannot say the same for a lot of like spaces on the left, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think this is why I also personally shy away from terms like the left, personally, or leftists. Like I don't really identify with the term because I think it makes up such a complex milieu of various parties who are not even aligned at all on certain things. Like I have an example, right? I'm not at all painting all Marxists in this light, but there's a certain breed of online Marxists who will use shit like what kind of like what you said with like someone's been talking about this for 200 years, but you went to a very positive place with it. They'll use that as a cudgel to say, therefore go read these fucking books and educate yourself before you can like as a way almost to enforce an intellectual hierarchy, and I actually hate that shit because it's like I don't want to force someone to go read 1100 pages of Das Kapital. If they're already here and they're ready to act on shit, they can do that whenever. But like, and that's not at all. I'm not fighting a broadside at all Marxists. I've plenty, there are plenty of like. I like the cybernetic Marxists on that one podcast. What's that one? I've been listening to in a while.
General.
Yeah, I love those guys. Right? They always have interesting takes. There are a lot of really good forward facing, positive, stuff happening in Marxist thought, especially around like the people who are intersecting with public choice theory and all that. But there's this is why I tried not to use the left, because those people end up being lumped in the left. These people who are like, well, did you read, this and that and the other, and you're going to have to if you want to like, step on. Man, what is the point of you, right? Like that's not why we're here, right? And I think to dovetail on your other point, it's exactly right. Like I've seen this in my experience, right? With you'll join a Twitter space, and maybe you'll like raise your hand, and you might jump in and be like, is that land stewardship project you were talking about, like is that actually run by indigenous people, or do they have a vote or say on it? And the people who are on that, I've seen this with my own eyes, will be like, no, they're not yet, and that is a huge problem, and can you just come in and propose something in our forum so that we can fix that? Right? like put a proposal up, right, and we'll show you it doesn't cost money. Right? It doesn't cost, and if it does, we'll like give you the gas for it or what have you, right? Like I've literally seen this happen in some of the ecosystems I'm in. So I'm like, it's like people can take these critiques if they're coming from the right place and their heart is in the right place. It's just a matter of like, you don't have to sit out there and own people on the internet all day. You can actually come in and do it yourself. You can do these things yourself.
I think it was Jason Prado I saw say this on Twitter, but like we're over indexed on like critique and under indexed in sort of doing action and building things. And I think that's what I want to say about like all like any other like criticisms you want to bring to me. Just remember that.
Yes. Absolutely. That's beautiful. Yeah. I love Jason. I put some money in Jason's company. I love what they're doing. Right. Like, and that's a great way to put it. Cause like Jason is also like critical of a lot of the shit that's happening out there, but he's also leading a team of data engineers and, back end and front end engineers who are building a new version of ride sharing that's owned by the actual drivers. Right. Like that's actually happening. So I think when you're out there, I'm not saying don't hurl your insults at me. I'm a big boy. I can take it. All I'm saying is that how do you spend your time from there is kind of what matters.
Well, speaking of spending your time, maybe you can give us just like a quick introduction on how you spend your time lately, because I know you've been you, as far as I understand, you like very quickly got involved in the crypto space and are now sort of full time in it after and before just working for a cooperative and working for a lot of other things.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like the stuff that I'm involved in now, I'm definitely happy to talk about. So I think the things that might be interesting to this audience in particular are, so I met the PrimeDAO folks last summer, right? And like, I don't even remember how. I think it was more that I had seen their funding announcement where they had raised like $2 million to build a more cooperative ecosystem for DAOs. So obviously, cooperative. I'm like, oh, you got my attention. What are you doing here? What does that mean? Right? And then and then I reached out to them and I was like, first, can I give you money? And second, they were like, no, sorry, we've already closed the round, but you should chat with us and see what we're doing. And so I'm working on Prime, and I'm happy to get into what that means. But basically, they built four products. They're building four products that basically make it easier for all DAOs to cooperate. And so it's not that we think that competition is going to go away, nor do I necessarily think it should. But it's more that if you open up more pathways to cooperation, those might be taken more often, right? So, what does cooperation for DAOs look like? It could be diversifying their treasury risk by doing a token swap. It could be joint funding something that both of them want, but that they then will equally use. That's prime pools, right? And then prime deals is the first one I talked about, token swaps, and among other things. And then, if you're actually new to the space and you just want to launch, we have a platform that lets you do that for free. And so I'm doing that. I'm one of the stewards of that project. And Prime is connected to Collectivo, which I don't do anything for right now, but I am very interested in. It's what got me Prime pilled. Collectivo is really interesting because um, this is kind of an example of what you were talking about at Dallas. When I met the Collectivo folks, they were telling me like, well, we want to build regenerative economies from the bottom up for abundance for all. And I'm like, interesting. Have you read Prado? I didn't say that. Just kidding. But like, it's stuff like that where you're like, I don't really care where you stand. That's excellent. Let's do it. Right. Um, and and then furthermore, I'm kind of there's a number of other projects. One of them I'm in a not in, so I'm not going to mention it. But if you follow me on Twitter, you can probably put two and two together. Um, and then before that, my background was basically I did a short stint in platform cooperatives. Really, over the last 4 years, I've been advising one of them, and then I joined one for about a year to help grow it, the Savvy Cooperative. And so, there's a lot of people out in the Web3 space writing about how DAOs are like cooperatives, but very few who actually have the experience of doing, doing work inside a cooperative and growing it the way that a venture scale company would grow, which is they're doing very well on that front. And then before that, I was just at a number of tech companies doing product stuff, marketing stuff. I co-founded one out of 500 startups a few years ago, which did okay. I'm not rich, but like it's fine. And then of course, everyone on this podcast and listening to it is rich if you're not in the global South. So it's all somewhat relative, um, but yeah, so that's like kind of the experience I bring to it, and that experience of organizing within cooperatives and deciding, how do we hold ourselves accountable? What are the systems we're building for ourselves? How does ownership work? Then gave me kind of a unique lens into this thing that they're now calling the ownership economy in crypto, which, I have a contentious relationship with, but I actually think it's, at the end of the day, I think it's okay. It just needs to be like any other thing in the space that's attracting attention. It needs to be bent to our will.
Yeah, yeah. I would like I one time I was tweeting like I want to invest in the ownership of the means of production economy rather than just like the ownership economy.
Yeah,
Just to like be more specific on like the type of ownership I want to
yeah,
what we want to invest in to create in the long run.
yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so like you're openly an anarchist, and I mentioned this before. I'm not really. I wouldn't call myself an anarchist, but I am very open to anarchist thought, and there's a lot of like anarchist writers that I really like David Graeber being one of them. So like sometimes I struggle with defining anarchism. So I'm curious to hear from you, especially in the context of the crypto space. Like what is anarchism for you?
Yeah, I think I have a different answer every time I answer this question, which some people would frown upon. But I think lately the one I'm kind of settling on is that it's kind of like those bullshit apocryphal quotes you hear from people like Churchill, right? Where they're like, democracy or capitalism is the worst system except for all the others. I actually think that I end up at anarchism not because I think I'm not some utopian, right? I actually think that this
You are against
like
utopia
literally, right? So
on
I was
Twitter.
talking to someone about this the other day, yesterday actually, and I was like, the reason I picked that is because I think that the state and um, the various neoliberal and what is the other neo one I can't think of now. Wow, brain not working this morning. But anyway, not neoclassical, right? Neoclassical
Yeah.
economics, all that. I actually think all of these are extremely utopian, right? And I think that for a very specific epistemological reason, which is that in order to make certain predictions about the future, the various scientific instruments and the philosophy of science they actually have that they carry as their baggage into their practice necessitates the reduction of certain complexities that then at the end of the day those complexities are stripped away for the benefit of certain parties, right? And the way that I got to this position was actually not even through some edgy anarchist. It was James C. Scott, right? I read Seeing Like a State a little over 4 years ago, and I was just like, wait a minute, this is who I've been the whole time, right? Like this whole the anti-authoritarian thing made a lot more sense to me, specifically not from the realms of like where people think of anarchism like people throwing bombs at cars or whatever. No, that's not. It's more about rejecting the high modernist authority of based on an epistemological stance, right? That there's actually much more information complexity, et cetera, that's being prevented from blooming, taking us into like a new way of relating, producing, living, et cetera. And that's kind of what anarchism means to me, is actually taking the shackles off of that, right? Actually letting things complexify as much as possible. And at the core of it be this is I finally got to this part later. It wasn't mine, but I actually like William Gillis, who's a writes for C4SS and is a believes coordinator of some sort there, like really talks about this a lot, is that at the end of the day it's also an ethical stance, in that you are for the maximization of agency for all beings, right? And so it is on their terms, right? And so that's really what it means to me at the end of the day. It's anarchy. Because anarchy is because like, why do I end up because anarchy? Because of this uh, idea that if you let this sort of epistemic, complexity, you know, mix, mingle, grow as much as possible, it will show the way towards new possibilities, and from the bottom up, especially. And that should not surprise you why I'm dabbling in some of this Web3 stuff now, right? because as I very much see it as technology to build new institutions from the people who are best placed to have the knowledge to that serves as a base for how to manage some kind of institution, right? And a lot of anarchists seem to be like, this guy just said manage. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, I'm happy to talk about the definition of institutions and all of that later too as well. But that's like why, like what it is for me is this respect for bottom up knowledge, the ability to assemble and disassemble institutions, and doing it while maximizing the agency of people who are subject to systems.
Could you explain a bit more, actually, how you connect that with your dabbling in the crypto space? Like, what got you into it? Like, what was it exactly that convinced you to get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's in the tail end of kind of what I said there, which is institutions, right? I think that years before I got back into this, because my first dabbling was like 2017, 2018, when DAOs were very, very, very early. And I liked the idea of them. I read about them. I met the Aragon folks, like Louise and Jorge, and well, just Louise and John Light, basically. And I was just talking to them a bit about, what are you all doing? Where are you going? I'd love to help out, but it didn't really materialize into anything back then. And then um, I ended up just extremely pushing into it this time because of a lot of the interesting projects that I see that have caught my attention, because they are, whether they know it or not, they are building new institutions, and they're building new ways to govern them and to spread the wealth and abundance that comes from them as far as wide as they can, given certain constraints, right? So like what convinced me was stuff like Gitcoin, right? Gitcoin in particular, I find very interesting because it started out, when you if you don't know what Gitcoin is, right? If we zoom out a bit, what preceded Bitcoin, if you're not familiar with all the politics and ins and outs of OSS, of open source software, right? Open source software, I'm not like the definitive expert on it, but a lot of the methods of the patterns of organizing within it, of building it, etc., were they mirror what some people's ideas are of anarchy. In some ways, that's both bad and good because it's like complete chaos in some places, which people associate with anarchy more or less. And then in other places, it's like more about what kind of stuff that I'm talking about, where you're able to co-create an institution with your friends, right? But OSS in particular back then, when it started out, was like, hey, you had a number of like Linux, a number of things were coming about, but then quickly in the late '90s and stuff, you began to see, and even before this, but you had the tech giants just hovering over them as a source of IP, right? Because they could just copy them, make one change, patent, make it a part of some new stack, an enterprise stack, and now it's whatever. And you see this as well in with Amazon, right? With AWS and specifically, you have like Amazon EC2, Elastic Stack, and all the that's basically just Elastic, the company, and its open source products in the Amazon version. And so, what's interesting about Gitcoin is I need to actually look this up right now. Edit this out or whatever you want, but I think it's actually good to have this here. I'll put in the show notes too. Elastic um, made a big change to their licensing, right? Um, Basically, they made a huge change because AWS and Amazon Elasticsearch, they've been doing things that since 2015 that have basically fucked Elasticsearch's entire business, right? So they wanted to prevent companies like Amazon taking Elasticsearch and Kibana and just providing them directly as a service without collaborating with Elastic at all, right? And Elastic's entire stack is open source, maintained by a long tail of folks, and they use that open source long tail to say, here's a product, do you want services with it? Great. And that's how Elastic makes money. Amazon is basically like, sweet, we'll do the same thing, right? And that's just, and so why is Gitcoin interesting? Gitcoin convinced me because I came back and looked at this and said, Gitcoin is making a market between people who want software for specific things and people who want to actually build that software. And then they go one step further and they say, let's make everything that comes out of this a public good, right? So that I think is an incredibly powerful idea, right? Now, of course, someone can sit there and still slurp up from the public good channel, but the bet is basically that at this point it doesn't necessarily matter because you're actually at least creating an economy that addresses the original sin, right? So like that I think is a pretty powerful idea, and I think there's all kinds of innovations downstream that don't have to involve locking up IP or whatever else to even make it as a public good transactable and remuneratable for the person who makes it, right? And that's why that thing back in I was like, okay, that's super cool. Making public goods and making a market for those public goods between that's actually functioning, because one of my positions is in this sort of left wing market tradition of anarchism is that what you see right now is not a functioning market, right? It's a market that's really captured by folks who have enough power to make it exactly the way it is. And I don't really need to point much further than look at the vaccines, right? like this, look at pharmaceuticals and the way that they're captured and all that for the interests of might as well be the same folks at the top, right? There's a revolving door between the state and the highest people who are in pharma who just go from one job to another and co-write their own legislation and everything else in favor of each other. So if we can, many ways removed from that, we have Gitcoin building a new institution, and they're literally saying, we want to make it. I've heard Gitcoin people say this: we want to guarantee the basic necessities of life for everybody, and we're starting with open source software. Yeah, okay, it's hard to believe, but maybe let's see where they get, right?
Yeah. I think the efforts around Gitcoin is really, really interesting to observe. I think like there are some criticisms that I understand about Gitcoin, but then there's also at the same time, they are sort of answering sort of like a direct need in which the state is clearly not does not care to like to come in and like fix a problem. So like I understand people who say something that Gitcoin is using the word public goods like incorrectly, which I kind of agree with. I don't think they're using the word particularly like the academically correct definition, and maybe there are some issues with that, and maybe you could say like, oh, they're just like creating a world in which we don't rely on taxes and instead we just rely on like the goodness in people's heart to give to charity. Like I can get those, I get those criticisms, but at the same time it's also a reaction to like a very serious need in the open source community that hasn't been answered for a very long time and has been an issue for a very long time. That like, I mean, there has been attempts to like sort of to push the state to do something about it, but they just don't. You know, like it is a pretty big issue, and I think it's easy to be like, oh, we just need to fund open source software, but like it doesn't even like you don't even begin to scratch the surface of like the issue and how you get close to that. So like I I keep those criticisms in mind when I think about and talk about Gitcoin, but I also admire their like pretty big attempt to fill this need, even if I have some reservations about some aspects of it. Like I don't use it as a reason to sort of
Hmm.
disengage.
Yeah, and I think like to even go further, right? Like it's not that Gitcoin's the only reason it appealed to me. It's to be clear, it's the features of things like Gitcoin, right? Where it's like we're we're addressing something that clearly results from collusion in the market between the state and capital, and also we want to show you that this can still actually function as a market should, and it can produce public goods, which is another interesting. That's kind of like the undercurrent to a lot of things that really caught my attention. And then going a step further, I don't actually necessarily, I don't necessarily believe in these as like some kind of panacea or solution for the future, but I'm watching these experiments very closely. Right, Gitcoin is doing a lot of very interesting things in quadratic voting, and so like if the audience isn't clear with quadratic voting, the super easy, it's extremely easy. It just sounds fancy, right? Like think of it as like you're literally I'm not even going to get into the math of it, even though the math is simple. All you have to know is that if you have a whale, a person with a ton of money, and the way that votes are done is through how much money you have in your wallet, what Gitcoin has done is actually raise an entire publicly funded pool of cash that then is doled out based on quadratic principles. So let's say, to give you, it's easier to understand through example. Let's say you have one thing that gets a thousand votes from one whale, and you have another thing that gets 100 votes from 100 different people that totals, in their amounts less than $1,000. Gitcoin will look at that, run a simple calculation, and top that up from the public funds pool because they're looking at revealed preference, right? So 100 people want this thing. One person wants this thing really badly, or actually, you don't even know if it's really badly. That person could have $1 billion, and $1,000 is nothing to them, right? So they really look at the end of the day and say, how do we top that up? And so you actually have a mechanism to fund the social and public goods that more people want, and you have a way to measure them and iterate on that. So I think that's actually fascinating, and like,
Yeah.
and it's
That's true. The experiments are really
yeah,
interesting. That's where like I do find it very interesting and something to pay attention to, not as like a see they're solving our
absolutely
problems,
not exactly.
you know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right because I think it has to be reminded too that like anyone who's telling you this is a solution is like extremely Web3 pilled, and or is a person who has some bags that they're trying to sell you, or maybe even has a rug that they're trying to pull. Right? For me, everything I'm doing in DAOs is an experiment. Right? Full stop. I am not. This is not at all like something where I'm turning and saying this is a solution. This is a new world we're building, and it may lead to one. Right? But like I have no idea. Act accordingly.
So I'm really curious on your thoughts as well, because it's clear that you and I find a lot of interest in this space because of the experimentation that's happening. But I mean, especially, I mean, the entire group that you would call the left, there is like this split, of course, when it comes to crypto and blockchain.
Hmm.
That it's very very it becomes very very heated
Yeah.
for a lot of people. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on like why do you think the anarchist community especially seems to be very very split on this stuff? Like for some people, I see anarchists who are like to them it's very obvious to get involved and that there's something useful for it, and for others it's like it's a no-go.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to comment on that, especially as being like I get probably a weekly or bi-monthly boost of this ranker from the C4SS post that I wrote a while ago on or co-wrote with a few folks. But yeah, I think in my view, I think that the split really it comes from a number of things, but the big patterns that stand out to me are people who are focused on the like hyper financialization of things and not wanting to make everything, a tradable good, which I actually grok. Like, I think that's totally fine. I think it's a defensible position. And my only problem with it is what, so what, right? Because it's actually happening, right? So, like, I think that I'm not saying you shouldn't post about it. What I'm saying is that we have to take some action on that front if we think it's bad. And what does that action look like, right? That's basically where I net out on it. And then on the folks who are, there's some other, there's definitely some other factions too that are absolutely against it. Going one step further than the hyper financialization folks are probably the like the primies, the primitivists who are basically essentially anti-civ, anti-energy use, anti-complexity, like a whole bunch of things. Them, I think I'm gonna. I shouldn't say too much more, but all I will say is that um, there are varying types of those folks, right? Some are extremely anti-civ. Some are like, we need to get rid of thought and the universe should be rocks, right? And some of that stuff is just like,
But I would think those people wouldn't even be online then at
you
that
would think so,
point.
but they are, right? Like, so, like, there are definitely some of them who are, and I'm just like, why are you here? But anyway, Um, that's kind of like the broad trends I see, though. There's to recount them, right? There's the folks who are against the hyper capitalized financialization of everything, which I think is definitely fine because I also do not necessarily want to live in a hell world where every single interaction of mine is like legible to some. Because when you make it legible, the next question is always to who, right? And so that can be an extremely dystopian world. And but for me, the answer is not I'm against it now. It's let's make sure that we build the things necessary to have it on our terms, right? And like one of the people I shout out here, which who I love, he's awesome. Is, Henry de, Henry de Valence. I don't actually know if I'm saying his name right, but Henry founded Penumbra Labs, and he was previously, I also don't know if I remember his pronouns, so apologies, Henry, if I butcher this, but I founded Penumbra Labs and was at Zcash before that. And Penumbra Labs, you don't actually need to know much about it. You can probably figure it out from this. One of my favorite things that Henry said, and I think this might be even pinned on his Twitter profile, is like, it's not enough to critique surveillance. You have to build privacy, right? And so, like, if that's your thing, where you're like, we must stop the hyper financialization of everything's bad, be like Henry, right? Like you must build something that makes what does that look like? What is it? What does the attack vector of hyper financialization look like? I don't know. You need to build tools where you need to build privacy tools that don't make every single thing you do legible to every blockchain or chain analysis or whatever, right? What does that look like? Someone going to fund it? I don't know. Maybe, right? Like there's a lot of things like that. And then I'm like, I know that's a good place to switch to the other side, right? Like, who is for this? It's a lot of the folks that I see for it in my communities too are not the usual suspects that the critics would think, right? Like one of the folks is Tux. Tux is the founder of Entropy.xyz, who's building decentralized custody, right? So at a very very simple way to say it is like if you own crypto on Coinbase, you don't actually own it because Coinbase has the private keys, right? To like, and so you don't own your private key, you don't own the crypto. That's kind of the point, right? And so um, with Tux is building this, but at the same time, Tux's experience, from what I've seen and talked to with them, is that um, this is a community where Tux is trans. Tux is like found built acceptance, co-created acceptance, and a great working atmosphere and everything uh, that they never received in the Web 2 world or anything. Right? Like it was just pure like. Just I don't know because I'm not a trans person, but I can imagine because I have quite a few friends, right? Or at least I don't have to imagine; they tell me. And so, folks in this space who um, are hackers who are building privacy, who have benefited from that, who found a community that has actually like co-created that and accepted that with them, seem to be really into it, right? And who have found like use cases that make a lot of sense for them or for their friends, like you know, I think whatever you might think of the future of crypto and the volatile ass markets that make it up, but if you're in, there are a couple of war zones that if you were unlucky enough to be born into, like me, decades ago, crypto has saved your ass, you know, a little bit, right? It's been one of the assets that if you were able to access it, you were able to at least find a way to get out or get food or something in the last couple of years, you know, Venezuela, etc. I'm not saying that that should make you pro it. We should be one step removed and saying, well, why is that fuckery happening, right? Why is the fuckery happening that makes this happen? Where a person in Nigeria or what have you goes, which, you know, Nigeria has has like sky high crypto adoption rates, which is why I threw that in. I'm not just throwing a random country in, right?
I think it's the highest
Exactly,
at the moment, yeah,
exactly.
or at least
But
recently.
yeah, that's kind of how I see the divide, right? The split comes between people have who are at a high level, kind of in that left or like ANCOM ish tradition, where they're like, we absolutely should not hyper financialize everything, and this is terrible. And then the primies who are like, I was already against this, and now I even more so. And then you have folks who have at least tried it a little bit and gained a little peak of the sense of autonomy that you can get from these technologies, and they're building privacy, they're building security, uh, they're building regenerative economies with their friends, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I totally get. I totally understand the this hyper financialization critique. I mean, it's something that I mean, I think all of us, a lot of people are broadly aware of and are sort of, I mean, afraid of, like openly, um, yeah, just openly afraid of, and like openly want to work against. And I think you have like a couple of choices. You either disengage because you don't want to support it from a moral position or something like that, or you pressure the state, which, you know, good luck if you think that's going to be successful and happen in a quick enough way where you're really going to be successful with that. I mean, uh, if that was a possibility, I would totally understand it, but I'm just not convinced that's going to happen anytime soon. And in a way that is sort of like left friendly. I just think that it requires such an expansion of state surveillance power to, you know, ban or put a moratorium on crypto or something like that. I mean, I think people really, really underestimate what exactly they're asking for when they say we
Yes,
need to ban it.
yes.
I think they really underestimate that. Or you can like engage it in like a meaningful way, you
Hmm.
know, which I think is sort of what we are trying to do more so.
Definitely. There's like, when you think about it, just to dovetail off your last thing there, when you're talking about like, how would you stop it? I'm not saying it's unstoppable either. I've been misconstrued on this point before. I do think that, you know, it's not inevitable. It's the world that you and I are talking about. It's not inevitable. It's a possibility within the confluence of these technologies. But I think that um, when someone says we need to ban it, do they understand that there are, as of right now, 2,475 nodes apparently on Ethereum node tracker, right, on Etherscan, and that, you know, these are distributed, you know, not through that many countries, probably like, I don't know, 40. Let's
Mostly the
get
U.S. and
mostly the
Europe. I
U.S. and
mean,
Germany,
sure.
exactly. But like, you're, what are you asking for? The SWAT team to go into every one of these places and destroy and just confiscate the node? Like, is that even feasible? is someone since someone else is there's fault tolerance, business, there's all kinds of fault tolerance and things built into it. There's market incentives at play where someone else will want to go do it. It's kind of like wanting to start to like stop drugs by starting a drug war, you know? I wonder if that's been done before.
We've had similar things happen before, and look how they've turned out.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, but one of the things, it's like one of the concepts that I think you and I both agree should be very, very interesting for the left, no matter what position you really take, in my opinion. But which has recently, like now, like in most cases, like most critiques, I find to be just like a few months behind what is like sort of like the cutting edge of the crypto space at that moment. So like only like right now, critiques have started reaching DAOs all of a sudden, whereas like before it was NFTs, and then like but they reached the NFT criticism part like 5 months after the all like people who are in maybe the spaces that you and I are in like are already broadly aware of the criticisms, are already broadly aware of the issues with it, and like have just like a better understanding of what it is. And I think, and so like when to get those criticisms like 5 months later, it's sort of like it's always exhausting. It's always just like ugh, like we know. We hear it over and over again, and like we talk about it with each other. It's not like something that people are ignoring. Like yes, I think it is like criticisms are being ignored at like probably the top levels of like the Web3 enthusiasts and like crypto boosters, because I mean that's what they're trying to sell. But like those are not the spaces that I think that we're saying that like other people on the left should be engaging in. We're saying you should come into the space that we are in already and sort of go forth with these criticisms, but like in a more constructive way.
And I think constructive is kind of the point too, because like, and it's right there in the word. It's construct, right? I'm not trying to like secretly pill these people into getting involved. It's more that like, if you followed my point around this Ethereum node thing, apply that to everything on against NFTs. Like, how are you actually going to stop it? Like, put some thought into that, right? Like, I legit mean like, yeah, if you if you legit think that this is a world destroying, climate destroying technology, I would want you to take that seriously. That's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah, I'm waiting for like the eco terrorist cells to start
like, that's what I'm saying. Like,
coming in.
take it seriously, right? I don't think that the critique, of course, that's a thing that needs to happen. I'm not saying don't do it, but like, then what comes next, right? Are you? I would like to see you steal a bored ape, right? Like, or whatever, right?
Yeah, fucking steal those
Yeah,
things. Like I don't
yeah,
know,
damn
like,
it.
who gives a shit?
This is not a justification for theft. I'm saying there are some certain potentialities that come from believing a certain thing and then wanting to see that happen in the world, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
But to get to my question, I'm just curious if you could maybe present a like the anarchist case for DAOs.
oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that I think that there are a lot of critiques of them for sure, right? And I think like William Gillis, in particular, has made some good critiques of them in terms of like governance on contracts and very technical arguments that I don't recall right now, but that we can put in the show notes that I think are very good. And I think other than that, though, here's the thing, right? One of the things that you can't do very easily right now is manage your money and do things with your friends. Take actions with your friends, right? Like, if you've been out there in a mutual aid society or something, you know what I'm talking about. It probably took you 8 months, if you were at all or even at all successful, in to fail at getting your nonprofit designation if you ever tried it, right? It took you like 8 to 12 months
Right.
and a
Yeah.
couple $1,000s, and then it didn't work because what the hell is a mutual aid society, right? Like things like this, right? And so, if there is an anarchist case for DAOs, it's that they allow you to, with a minimum of legal entity involvement, have an encapsulation of a thing that lets you co-manage money and verify that certain actions that you want to see happen did happen, right? And so that's the core of it. And so if you have those two little things, money and actions, you have a huge space of innovation, spaces of innovation for anyone who's interested in having uh, actions without hierarchies, or controlling this sort of like whirlwind of action that comes about from horizontal movements and directing it somewhere, right? And so like that at a high level, I think is the case for DAOs, because you have these tools that you can now jump in if you're ideologically aligned on certain outcomes and just start using, right? And and when I go back to the original thing around managing money with your friends, it's extremely difficult from the state's point of view to do that, because they will tell you right now, there's one person. Who's the person that's whose name is on the paper who does these things? And it's like, that doesn't make sense to us. That's not how we do this, right? And so, like, and I will also say, just to throw more DAO skepticism out there, DAOs are not the only ones doing this, right? Like, there's a like I wouldn't call it a rich tradition. The company's not that old, but one of my favorite companies out there is Open Collective, right? And Open Collective already has been doing this for like 6 years, 6 or 7 years, right? Xavier Daman and Pia Mancini, and there's another founder. I don't remember the third founder's name, but basically they've made it such that any group anywhere can get a fiscal host in a legal entity within a geography where they can accept money transparently and pay invoices transparently for services that any type of organization does, which drastically lowers the cost to activate an organization like this and manage money with your friends. Now, that doesn't mean that Open Collective is all anarchists. Absolutely not. It's just a way for you to organize that's different than an LLC with a board and a CEO or and all that, right? So that, I think, is the case for DAOs. They can be what you want them to be, right?
Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the interview or find the content that I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons: Sean, Nathan Schneider, Andre, Rick Lomas, Ben, Justin, Felipe, John, Hacker Mom, Buck, Justin, monolithbra.eth, Al G, Julien, Nick, and Ryan. As you can tell, there's been quite a few more Patreon subscribers, which is really nice for me to see. Any amount really helps, since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did, and access to Patreon exclusive contents like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last Patreon Q&A episode, I gave my thoughts on the proof of stake versus proof of work debate from a socialist point of view. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. So thanks a lot, and let's get back to the interview. Just to add, like with the Breadchain project, we also have an open collective. But I mean, I got very lucky that somebody was able to hook me up with to be the fiscal host for us, because we don't have we're so small, and we are all working sort of like volunteering our time to make this project happen, that we're sort of like relying on our network to sort of help us out in certain ways, and we just don't have the capacity or time to like go through the full process of making a legal entity before we do anything, right? Like why do we need to wait until these like very boring and stupid administrative processes are done before we do anything? Why do we need to like adhere to that if we find what we're doing is important? So just in our experience of like building Breadchain to where it is at the moment, we were able to spin up a multi-signature wallet in a couple of minutes. You just the contract is there, it's built. We have now a space where we can hold money together, and then like took a little bit more time. I think we got pretty lucky that shout out to Leo. He was able to like get us an open collective fiscal host very, very quickly. But if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to accept money in fiat, right? We have to go through this huge process. And like I know a couple of people from Open Collective. They're all into DAOs. They're all into crypto. Like none of them. Like I just am imagining the argument right now with someone saying like, oh yeah, but okay, you don't need DAOs because Open Collective is there. Like the Open Collective people are also very pro DAO because I think they understand the space probably better than most of us do.
Absolutely. And I'd say depends on who you talk to. There are a healthy amount of DAO skeptics in OCE too, which is good, right? Because they have stewardship of an incredible responsibility based on who is already on OC and how they shepherd that community, right? So it's important for them to be very skeptical of like, if we convert OC to a DAO for exit to community, what are the implications, right? Like they're going to figure out some amazing things along the way that are going to help. That's going to help all of us, I think. And so shout out to Pia and everyone else there, because I'm a big fan. And then what was the other thing you said? Something around, oh yeah, on the blockchain side of things with OC, right? Like Pia's partner, Santi Siri, is the guy who does Proof of Humanity, right? And that's like that. I feel like we could talk about that forever, but I think that's just a fascinating project because it's not something that ever occurs to people. They just accept it as, well, the state has this registry where they determine who's a person by a particular manner, and we don't even think about it that way. We just have our IDs, right? And that's your proof of humanity. But if you wanted to have a, self-consistent, internally self-referential, but non-duplicatable, non-replicable, non-gameable database of who is an actual person, so that you can decide how to spend money with that person, whether to spend money on them, whether to enable certain things for them to do, actions, etc., that is a hairy problem. That's a really difficult coordination problem. And that's coming back around to it, why this space should be interesting for anyone who's anarchist leaning or an anarchist. You can co-create those things right now yourself, right? So
Yeah. So you have now been working on PrimeDAO, which is a really, really interesting project, but sometimes a little bit hard for people to wrap their heads around it because it's sort of like 3 levels higher. Like once you understand what a DAO is, then you got to go 3 more levels higher, and then you can kind of understand what PrimeDAO is doing,
yeah,
I feel like.
yeah, definitely.
But what they're doing is really, really interesting. But I'm wondering if you could try to explain that for
Absolutely happy to talk
guide
about
us.
that. So cool. Yeah. So what is it? Yeah, happy to get into the multiple levels of what Prime DAO does, right? So Prime is basically at a high level, when you look at our positioning, everything, we make it really easy for DAOs to be more cooperative, right? For them to basically uh, take the cooperative route, right? So what does that mean? It's being able to make deals between each other. It's being able to co-fund joint ventures where everyone, not just the two people, not the two entities funding it, benefit. And there's a number of novel mechanisms to do, and also you can launch. There's a number of other things. We have 4 products. I'm happy to go into them, later. But basically, um, one, now you're in a DAO, right? And we're talking about, we just kind of made the case for like why you'd want to do this, why DAO like things are happening on OC, right? With open source communities and all that kind of stuff. Why, what's next? Well, if you just started this thing and you're brand new on the block and there's a lot of hype between what you're doing or there isn't, you kind of need to bootstrap the project, right? And this comes around even to the cooperatives problem itself, right? Like, how do you start a cooperative without capital? How do you start it when everyone who has capital is expecting outsized returns? Why would they give you money for this, right? We're opening up ways for people to bootstrap their DAOs with each other, right? So, like, if you came in, like, what does it look like when one DAO loans another DAO money to get something, right? Like, and what do the loan terms look like? Right? Why would they do that? Right? That's a question that's an interesting question for us to sort of figure out for everybody, right? Because if you're new on the block, we got to help you get started, right? And then, of course, everyone is not always an altruistic actor, but we want to make altruism easy to take as an action. So let's open that up. What does that look like, right? That's one of the things. And then, like, Prime Deals is essentially just when we kind of are we're going to be launching Prime Deals probably 3 to 5 weeks from now, depends. That will be a way for all DAOs, any DAO that wants to come in with no code, to basically say, here is what we want to see, and this is the money that we're putting in. Here are the actions that we want to see, observable actions on the chain, right? And this is the money that rides along with those actions. If these actions happen, we will swap. We will swap these funds, or one DAO will give funds to another one, right? And it doesn't have to be money for money. It can be money for actions, actions for money, what have you, right? And so that is I think going to unlock a shit ton of innovation in the DAO ecosystem, because there's a ton of DAOs right now who are sitting there going like, I need a way, I need an easier way to pay people. I need an easier way to have someone do X, Y, and Z, and they have bounties, right? Which is like something that they can do. They can put a bounty out and say, please, someone build it from the crowd. Or if there's someone out there who's actually an expert on it, and maybe their DAO is the entire point of it, they can just go say, hey, let's do a deal. All right. And so like that can get both parties going. And then lastly, like we also offer this launch pad for people. Like, why do we exist? It's basically just DAOs. If you're out there and you want to launch a token, like in a in an environment where it's super easy to do, and we will provide some resources for you. We are not legal experts. We are not deflating your legal risk, nothing like that, but we are some resources that we have gone through ourselves that are out there that you can look through, right? There's LCAs in Colorado, there's Swiss foundations, there's a number of other legally encapsulating entities that can help you do this. we'll give you the launch pad to do a liquidity offering, basically, right? And LVP. So that's super easy with Prime Launch, and that's kind of our way of hopefully just pouring some more gas on the DAO. On this DAO sort of summer, or this DAO summer we just came out of, right? And that's what these DAO to DAO interactions sort of concretely look like, right? And so, like one of that's coming up, or sorry, one that just happened was this Vesta is launching a protocol, is launching an Arbitrum, right? And they're using us because we work with Arbitrum, and so Vesta is a protocol that basically lets people come in and make loans, and they're great. They're great for protocol loan liquidity platforms, especially because they're working with Olympus. And we were able to manage this three-part relationship, with launch. So that's kind of what we do.
Mm. Is that so? Like, kind of what I'm hearing is that part of what you guys are doing is sort of making it sort of like interdependent networks of DAOs through sort of like each one kind of owning a little bit of the other, which is not, it's not unlike, if you go to like the upper echelons of business, like a lot of these companies, they own each other, and so like that's why you have, with the recession or whatever example you want to choose, like when one falls, like this whole ripple effect of
Oh
everything else
yeah.
sort of happens, and it's sort of like, but it's one way that it creates resilience
Yes.
at the same time. Like I think that's why capitalism has been so good at staying resilient, like crisis after crisis. They have this type of interdependence with one another because they have like, um, I mean, they have their class interests in mind. It's just the wrong class, if you ask me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas, whereas like I think with DAOs, with the potential that it makes it a lot easier to create, cooperative like structures. Not all of them are, and there's this, of course, this critique of sometimes DAO people say that they're cooperatives and they're really not, and whatever. We all know those criticisms, but the truth is that it is also, it's opened up a very, very interesting space, and I think you can attest to that, being from having worked in a cooperative and not just talking about cooperatives. Like there is something interesting to that functionality for a cooperative in general, and being able to, I think I can't remember which number principle it is of the ICA, but like cooperatives depending on other cooperatives, or like helping out your fellow cooperative, because that's how you build up the cooperative ecosystem. And then of course there's, if you want to be like another pedantic leftist and say like, oh well, cooperatives aren't going to bring about socialism, like no shit, duh, of course, like that's not the point, right? There's
Uh,
like, this is just, we're talking about one specific thing, one specific action that sort of like can lead up to, in conjunction with a lot more actions, could build something that's actually resilient. And that's part of and that's part of like the puzzle. Like we can't, I think, to expect that if one person is sort of like advocating for one thing as being helpful towards the left, doesn't mean that like what they're advocating for is like the answer.
yeah.
Like I think we kind of, what is annoying to me is sometimes I think we literally do view on the left sort of like have this free marketplace of ideas where we're just like buying one idea, that we consume as being
The
like,
one idea.
this is it, and this
Yes.
is and this becomes part of our identity, but it's obviously a much more complicated
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely. And I think the resilience point is exactly right. You nailed it. Because I sometimes forget to put it this way, but a lot of the biggest DAOs with the biggest treasuries, we're talking like $1 billion, hundreds of millions of dollar treasuries. Many of them are sitting like, 80%, 60%, 90% in their native governance token, right? So like that would just be like, if you look at some of these gigantic capitalist entities you're talking about, there's a treasury manager at Pfizer who makes sure that Pfizer is not denominated only in dollars, right? Like that's literally their job, right? So there's a treasury manager. We're not treasury managers, but basically we want to facilitate people who want to do that, to say like, hey, and we did it ourselves, right? We set the standard ourselves when we launched the Prime token in December by executing token swaps with Olympus, Gitcoin, and Balancer. So all those three, big guns helped us bootstrap our liquidity by doing a 250K token swap from our total supply. So that, like, we just want people to then think, what are you doing? How can you do that for yourself, and why should you? Right? You want to build resilience, and you want to make sure that you have skin in the game with the mission of other folks that are aligned with your mission.
Yeah, yeah. So like, I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how I think the term that you guys use is like DAO to DAO interactions, which I think is really interesting. That's really like big brain stuff to me. Like it's sort of it's starting at like the seeds of what is, it's like on the verge of either a dystopia if you are like very against, I don't know, using smart
Yeah.
contracts for interaction, or potentially like something very very new and novel, and that could be potentially beneficial
Yeah.
depending on like how you go about
Yeah.
it.
I'm happy to like lift the veil on doubt. If you're, I'm sorry to cut you off. If you're, the rest of your question was going to be DAO to DAO interactions and what do they concretely look like, I'm happy to tell you. I'm happy to give you an example. One is the
Yes,
one is
definitely.
kind of like the one, if I pick one of those, this is all public knowledge, right? The swaps. Let's put it this way, right? Like, how does that happen, right? And it's none of it, very, very, very little of it is like, my people might look at it and go like, oh, dystopia of like programmable contracts and voting. And it's like, actually, that's not how that happened, right? We we will have existing relationships with folks, or we will have a way to
Human-based
human-based ones,
relationships.
exactly. We're like,
Right, like it's not just all like
exactly.
robots talking to each
It's
other or something.
absolutely not, right? It's not on-chain voting, on-chain relationship. It's actually us having existing human relationships with folks who understand what we're trying to do and our values aligned with what we're trying to do, right? Now, let's take um, just any one of those from that token swap, right? We have a lot of folks in Prime who are deeply embedded in Gitcoin. I'm not one of them, but there's a few who are, and they basically said, "Hey, we're doing this thing. This is what the project is about. You've known it, but you even invested in it, right? And now this thing is coming up. Our launch is coming up, and we want to. We are very aligned with you. We have always been right. You can literally look at our wallets and see like we've supported you, right? We're not bullying you here, but we are aligned with you, right? And we're launching a thing that's at least one level removed from what you're doing, but it's still super aligned, right? Are you in or out? And of course, our partners, they look at this and they like where we're going, right? So they go, great, we should. Now, his is where it gets a little more interesting. This next part is really up. This is why I say there's so much innovation happening here, like in terms of how we relate to each other, how we relate to money, and how we act together, right? Depending on the organization, the person getting that message, our message on the other side could say, great, I'm the owner of a 7-person multi-sig wallet. I'll talk with the other folks and see what they think. Or it could be, go open a proposal in our forum in discourse or what have you, and let's talk it through. And then let's run a vote. And if the vote passes from enough with a quorum or whatever, it goes. Or it could be the same thing. It could be do both of those, right? Maybe we have a multi-sig, but it only happens via multi-sig if it passes through the forum, right? There's a number of ways that this concretely takes shape, but it starts with the human relationship, right? It literally starts with like the Discord DM or the Discord group chat or the Telegram group chat and a video call or a meeting in person. And we hash through all the various levels of risk and what we're trying to do. And then it's captured in via software, right?
That's what where I think some critiques on the left get wrong, where they are critiquing potentially maybe like the ideological part of the technology, but they're not understanding the technology in practice, which is where they're missing out on where it's interesting and why people who are actually doing it in practice, like it gets really tiring just like listening to the criticisms all the time whenever they're not speaking to the
Yeah,
practice.
absolutely. And when the practice can take shape in a lot of ways, where it can be very much, it can facilitate input from a lot of different parties. It can facilitate consensus and dissensus, right? Like there's a lot of things going on like that where you can actually just step out and say like, no, we actually know we included parties in it because we can see their either their posts or their votes on chain right here, right? And like, now, of course, all of these things can still, I'm not saying any of it is perfect, right? You can still hijack these processes. You can still be a whale in some ways if you are sitting there with full democratic governance, and one whale can come and tip the scales completely, right? So you are still doing things like potentially going to doing the same thing you do in real life, which is like, oh, if we want that to pass, we're going to have to, we're going to have to go massage it with that one whale and make sure he puts it on the right side, right? That's going to happen, right? That's a problem we need to address. Maybe quadratic funding addresses that. Maybe it's or quadratic voting, right? There's a number of things we could do. So there's still room to get this right. And so,
Like I,
yeah.
but that is like, I mean, that feeds into like this criticism that I think probably both you and I share, is like the issues with token governance, which even Vitalik himself
Yes.
has criticized that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think if you know there are people like the first rendition has been token governance, and because it was like the easiest one,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
simple. But like people clearly are seeing like the issues with that and are looking for alternatives,
Mm-hmm.
and like that's where it's getting interesting. And that's basically, I mean, this is, if you really dig down into that critique, it's basically like, okay, the power of capital is too much. How do we reduce it? How do you create governance mechanisms to reduce that? How do we change the relationships, the social relationships
Yep.
that are encoded via this technology to facilitate like a better outcome that we would rather see collectively than like in the interests of these whales? Like, and probably there is a bit of like class struggle where these whales want to keep it how it is. And by whales, I mean really, I mean it's funny that they say whales. I mean it's just like a capitalist. Like you can just say a capitalist, or would you say like Warren Buffett is a whale of the economy as well? I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely. I kind of like it when you put it in those terms, actually, because it makes you think in the regular meat space economy, we should be thinking of those people as having outsized influence on our lives, but we just accept it, right? We don't call Bill Gates the whale Bill Gates making here reshaping philanthropy, right? We just go like, oh, Bill, the great and humble Bill Gates who reinforces IP and ensures that many children starve and don't have access to a vaccine, right? I'm sorry, letting my politics bleed out a little bit. Sorry, Bill Gates.
but yeah, so like there are these all these like really interesting things that a good left wing critique would probably be listened to a lot, because it actually goes in the interests of like a lot of these people who are building this stuff, and to sort of like think that they align with, I don't know, they align with like the Chris Dixons, or like the really big capitalists in this world somehow, is just not true. It's like it's just like not in practice
Hmm.
how it happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the on-chain governance one is a good example because I am not at all sold on it myself. And in as you said, Vitalik years ago wrote a good piece on that. And I think the more and the Bitcoin maxis will be completely against it, right? Obviously, it's like no, it's it's law, code is law, whatever. But it's just like we are not
No, it's not.
yet at a point where the complexity of human relations, I think, can really capture that, and we are more likely to build dystopias if we think so.
So I know another project that you have been expressing a lot of interest in is Cosmos, which is a project that I also found pretty interesting. And I spoke to, of course, Ethan Buckman a while back on the project, who's I believe he's one of the founders. Um, but I'm curious to hear what do you like about it, about Cosmos? Because it's different than Ethereum.
Yep. I am definitely 100% Cosmos pilled, and we'll get into why as well. But like number one is Cosmos is a philosophy more than a blockchain, right? It's a philosophy built. Its philosophy is built on sovereignty, interoperability, provenance, a bunch of other things. But basically, the first two stand out to me as really important because it's not like a blockchain, it is the internet of blockchains, and they really mean that. They've given you all the tools to build your own blockchain for whatever institution you want to build on, right? So like that's why you see such a vast, amazing diversity of projects in the Cosmos ecosystem. Like Regen is the one that I talked about. Maybe I mentioned earlier, but Regen Network is one of the most fascinating ones to me, in that they're like building distributed ledgers for land stewards to basically be able to make their land productive in certain ways that can facilitate selling of eco credits from land to someone who wants to basically say we need better outcomes, right? So one of the things they prototyped here was doing this with Microsoft and the Australian government, right? So they basically facilitated 500k of carbon credits through Regen Ledger on land steward folks who you're raising cattle, trapping carbon, all kinds of various regenerative land projects through Regen Ledger, right? And so when I think of stuff like that and how extensible Cosmos is, I'm they've got my attention, man. And the fact that they've really thought through in that ecosystem assumptions around shared security for inter-blockchain communication. So I know it's a lot of like jargon, right? The point is that wherever you're building in this Web3 universe, there is a $150 billion market cap ecosystem that doesn't care if you do it on their stuff. They will build out to you, and they will help your users funnel value into and out of their ecosystem. And that $150 billion market cap chain, or Internet of Chains, because Cosmos is not $150 billion, but the Cosmos Hub certainly is. I don't know, after today, maybe it's 130. Right? Like, I'll go and check on it. But point being that it's fundamentally built cooperativity and interoperability into the philosophy of what it does. And that's why I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I think just to clarify for some people who may not understand the difference, 'cause I think we talk about regen. He's not talking about this project as being like a DApp built on Ethereum. It's its own sovereign blockchain, which is a part of the Cosmos hub, which is a different relationship, because in the DApp scenario, you're still dependent on the assumptions made in the Ethereum blockchain, and that you need Ether to use it. Whereas in the Regen blockchain, you can use the Regen token to interact with this. You don't need to have Ether, for example. And it's used for like a specific application at the same time. So it's more like a blockchain application as opposed to maybe you would refer to as a DApp, which would be an application using smart contracts on top of a blockchain. It's a little bit complicated, but what's interesting about the Cosmos Hub, the Cosmos project in general, is you have this IBC protocol, which is essentially a standard to allow for many different blockchains to be able to communicate with one another very easily. So you can switch swap your assets from one chain to another, but still be a part of this like connected hub. So it's very easy to sort of switch between them, and you can create a full blockchain just for one application, still in like a decentralized manner. And what I also find interesting that people sort of ignore is that they've been a proof of stake network for a very long time and have been successfully doing it for a very long time. Whereas some people sort of like critique proof of stake as like not actually existing or never happening, but it in fact has been happening for quite a long time. It's just sort of been ignored, and
exactly. And
and Ethereum's on the way to doing that. And of course, they're going a bit slow, and you can critique how long they're taking, blah blah blah. But you cannot deny that proof of stake has already been happening.
Exactly. And so like that, that was a great summation, because I use a lot of jargon. And I think you hit on a lot of key points. IBC, I think, fundamentally opens up a lot of, if you think of all the things I said about Prime and DAO to DAO, I think IBC fundamentally opens up a lot of bottom-up individual opportunities for people to funnel value, from ecological things to, DeFi and degen behavior. So I think that there's really interesting things coming up here, where 2022 is going to be this year where the DeFi pipes really open up to Cosmos. And then with the amount of people who are building things in DeFi and in just like regen and other, regenerative climate focused projects is all happening on Cosmos, I think that there is going to be a really interesting shift in and flow throughput of resources through that ecosystem towards regenerative finance, regenerative ecology, climate, all these things. And then the fact that it's plugged in, then I don't actually know about this one. I'll have to check on the status of it, but I know that Chorus One has been working with Celo and Cosmos to build an IBC between Cosmos and Celo, right? So that opens up the Climate Collective projects to the Cosmos ecosystem. There's fundamentally this point of view from Cosmos people that they don't care if they are the rent extractive network for your thing. They want to work with you and make sure that people who are interested in what you're doing have a way to access it on their network.
Right. There is this like inherent property of Ethereum applications, is that you have to pay rent to the Ethereum network to use that network, which is a different relationship than like a sovereign, Cosmos IBC blockchain. Which to me, like when I think about, if I really like put my utopian hat on for the Cosmos blockchain and ecosystem, I like begin to wonder where is it going to take us in terms of like really, really building out separate, almost separate economies, although they're still interconnected economies on each blockchain. So like, how do you think about like building, I don't know. I mean, I really hate like doing things like this, but like, Anarcho chain or like Marx chain or whatever on the Cosmos hub, which is a different, it's very different than these past attempts, these very sad past attempts of like trying to be like overtly political, on like a specific, like their own sovereign blockchain, which has like no interoperability with anyone,
Yes.
versus being a sovereign blockchain, but also having this IBC compatibility.
Absolutely. And I think that like this is why Cosmos is so interesting to me, is that you hit on it right there when you said economies, right? Like my entire thing, I hope I'm becoming really annoying on this front. If you're listening to this, you're like, well, this guy, shut up about this. Is that there are ways to build new institutions, and you can set the rules for those institutions with your friends. You want to make a new bioregional economy that captures the land restoration in a particular square of land that you bought on some acreage of land that you bought with your friends, and you want to make that land legible from the perspective of, there's air quality, there's soil compactability, there's other factors you're trying to track, the like regen, astral protocol, all these things that can work together. uh, use them with your friends, right? Like it can happen right now. All right, so that kind of, and then build this, you want to build a circular economy around this. It's happening right now, right? In the Collectiva project, they're doing food forest regeneration projects that are 3 years in at this point, that are beginning to be financed by blockchain yield, right? And so you can literally find, as a DeFi degen, you can sit there and say, you know what, I actually want to see food sovereignty and non-dollar sovereignty for that island that's getting wrecked um, by inflation. I can literally just point some of my yield that way, or I can just point, or I can give them access to Regen Ledger or something, right there. I can build out access to that seller part of the ecosystem. There's all kinds of possibilities, right? Where you're building your own economies. Like there's actual ways for you to track value, share value.
To me, I think the big benefit to, I mean, really to using blockchain in general, but especially in IBC, is gaining interoperability with the rest of, in a limited sense, the economy, or like an economy that you can then interact with. Whereas opposed to like, I don't know, some past very sad attempts at making like Marx coin or something like that, where they're their own blockchain and there is sort of no interoperability with anything else, and it was doomed from the start.
Yep. Absolutely. and and it's that thing, right, where like this is why the you jump into a little bit more of what I'm doing here is, I, one of the things you and I talked about earlier when you met was the idea of like, how do we start more cooperatives? How do we fund more cooperatives? How do we fund more shared ownership ventures? Right. That's kind of like how I got into this ownership economy idea, what it meant to me when I started seeing it pop up here. And so like that's one of the things that I'm currently working on, is to say, how do we fund more things in the Cosmos and Regen ecosystem that are maybe one or two steps removed from Cosmos region itself, right? Like, are you building a new data source? Are you building a new way to measure water quality and, watershed health and things like that? You can do it on Regen, or you can build it and point the data source at Regen Ledger, or you can, do you need something that can turn DeFi yield built on Osmosis, which is one of the dexes on Cosmos? Um, do you want to turn the yield that you generate from osmosis and point it to a land restoration project? Well, we don't have the pipes yet. Let's build that, right? So it's going to be focused on stuff like that. And that's also why I'm, Region Cosmos build, because I think that this is a really great place to build that, because you can do it in a way where you don't have to necessarily capture rents and build your entire thing on IP, right? Like there are other mechanisms to capture the value for people who are worried about that. And that at the same time lets you then see what good can you do with this, right? Like if you put it out there for people who eagerly want to build this and just need money and a little bit of expertise.
Yeah, and that's where I think people get this like financialization critique a lot sometimes, is because um, I think there is certainly parts where more financialization is happening, but there's also parts where financialization I think is really just shifting. Like it's moving from one space to a different space. And of course, maybe we can have a debate or a discussion about which space was better to financialize. But there is something interesting happening in it, and it's happening anyways.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a good point because like my argument for it, I'm completely like this is not even a sophisticated one, which I'm throwing out there just because it's top of mind for me and I'm open to it being just absolutely destroyed. Is um, one of the ideas that the region folks and other folks in particular are looking at is this idea of ecosystem services and ecological accounting, right? And so one of the things that I feel like this is uncontroversial is that um, externalities used to compute certain variables in neoclassical economics may I'm not saying they're responsible for our current ecological destruction and climate change, but it's hard for us to say who has contributed what and how much to the current bioregional collapse and all these kinds of things, right? So one argument for it could be that what is a way for us to make these things legible, to make these assets accountable to some party, and then actually say what is the total cost of doing business, right? If you're a Nescafe, or if you're Nestle, if you're some multinational that puts a shit ton of single use plastics into the ecosystem, what is the cost of that, and can we impose that cost on you? Right, like that. And I see that as kind of the other side of this ecological accounting and financialization, where people go like, well, oh, that's just going to financialize everything. And I'm like, perhaps one of the problems is the things that we all depend on are not financialized enough. Right, like these public goods, these ecosystem services the economists refer to them as, right? Like those things are not captured in at all the same way that a balance sheet is captured, or even like waste and plastic, in which actually has to be reported to a central authority, right? We haven't built those systems, right? We haven't really we understand them. Experts to a certain degree on this planet understand them if they're involved in if they're if they're into mycelium, and they're they're in forest management or what have you. They, to some extent, they're single one-offs too. But what if we got crowds of experts software where they could actually uh, have the information processing mechanisms to begin to address the complexity of these ecosystems and see what we can do? I don't know. I'm pretty interested in that outcome.
I think maybe there's maybe a fine line, but like an important line in difference between financialization and just accounting.
Yes, 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 absolutely. Yeah.
So it's like there is accounting for things in which it may look like financialization,
Yes.
but I think we have to be critical and like very careful with how we define that as being financialization or
I
not.
completely agree. And see, I already told you I was going to make a mistake. I threw it out there and I did. Bam. Right. And I think you're exactly right. I actually think that can be a harder line, right? And then you can decide what kind of financial instruments you could even want to use once you have accounted for things, right? Like maybe there's some use of some financial instrument that I don't even know of that could actually be fruitful for something. I don't know, right? But like at least knowing what we're accounting for, right? Like having ecosystem services in a legible way. Uh, it doesn't have to be on Regen Ledger either, right? There could be a number of things that don't exist yet that we can put to
Mhm.
work in here, right?
So that this basically what we're talking about essentially as well. I don't know if you mentioned it, but this is regenerative finance or refi, which is another space that is, I guess, a bit ignored because I think it's a complicated one. And I'm not saying that I find it interesting, but I'm not saying it's perfect, and that I agree with everything that's being done, and that just because I have one positive thought about it doesn't mean that I'm like fully gung ho. We need to drop everything that we do and go into refi, but that I think it is interesting and worth looking into by more people. And this is refi, especially a place I think where another place where they would listen to people on the left.
Yeah, definitely. And there are like, and I think like to be clear for the blockchain folks, sorry if I piss anyone off here, but like regenerative finance is also not a thing that's new, right? Like this is not a this is an idea that's at least 10 years old. There's There's
Yeah, at least.
yeah, at the very least, I know that Gregory Landua, the CEO and founder of Regen, wrote a book on the eight forms of capital and regenerative enterprises, like in 2013 when he was running like a chocolate cooperative or something, right? Like, so he's at least seeded this a long time ago, and just the idea that, what if regeneration with financialization, right? Like, what if you put pools of capital into the hands of people who will be governed by the outcomes of that capital, and let them actually do that, right? And then use that stewardship to get people to better racial, social, ecological outcomes, right? It's as simple as that, right? And then and um, and you see some of these ideas bubble up in impact investing and triple bottom line accounting and all that, but this is really more wholeheartedly trying to swallow a lot more, like we've been saying, the accounting side of things, and saying, what is the whole thing that we're impacting, and how can we steer the whole thing towards a better outcome that's not only denominated in dollars.
Um, and so I've heard that you are starting a new podcast as well. You're becoming a fellow
Oh,
podcaster.
Jesus. Yeah. Aren't we
Are the
all?
rumors true?
Yes. Yes. The rumors are true. You're going to hate the name, but we are married to it for now. We're calling it the Ownership Economy Podcast, and we're basically going to be chatting with everyone who is building new futures, broadly expanding governance technologies so that we can broadly distribute wealth. That is the phenomenon that we're interested in, and what we are calling the ownership economy. So that means that we are basically talking to entrepreneurs, investors, people in government, activists who are all, from those kind of four pools of people who are all kind of actively involved in shaping, either by building or working on the legal structures, or being impacted by all the innovation that's kind of happening in this relative space that we're kind of calling Web3 now. We'll see if it stays that way, but um, and yeah, that's kind of what it's all about. So we'll be announcing that. Or I think some people have to edit this part. Yeah, so the first three episodes came out recently. You should check them out. They should be on ownershipeconomy.com, and you can find it in any in iTunes and all Anchor and all the broadly distributed podcast platforms.
Nice. That's really interesting that you're sort of like this fairly new word that's been minted that has been used by a plethora of different people, including venture capitalists, to talk about ownership economy, and instead it seems like you're trying to take it and now actively try to shape what that word should mean and influence where it goes, rather than like I don't know if you've ever read that piece by Austin Roby. He had written about ownership, but like and the issues with how people think about ownership, especially in Web3, of like just because you own a token and have exposure to upside doesn't mean you have ownership, which is I think what a lot of maybe certain VCs will say. But I think likely this podcast will go a little bit deeper into what the issues of that are.
Absolutely. And I think you hit on it, because basically I think that what rides along with ownership is this ability to govern the systems that govern you, and the ability to coordinate all of the actors that are in that system. And then lastly, we would be being able to broadly distribute upside that comes out of that system, right? And it shouldn't. And if you're able to game it in the current meat space system, it means you're able to concentrate and get outsized returns because of privileged access to ownership. And that is not what we think the ownership economy is, my friends.
Nice, cool. Um, well, thanks a lot. This has been a super interesting conversation. That was really awesome. It was good to see you again. But maybe just to finish it off, if you want to let people know where they can follow you and keep up with what you're
Oh
doing.
yeah, definitely. You can find me on Twitter at Against Utopia. I'm not shit posting that much these days. All of it is very mostly public goods focused Web3 stuff. So come hurl your critiques at me. I'm always open to them. And as I said, Ownership Economy Podcast. Check it out. And yeah, I think that's about it. That's it for me on the internet. You'll find me in Discord and Telegram
Mm.
groups, but you'll be easy to find after you if you jump on Twitter.
Yeah, and they'll find you at like plenty of these like crypto conferences as well. I know you travel
Oh,
quite a
that's
bit
right.
and attend these actively.
Good point. I will be at East Denver which is coming up soon, and you'll probably see me at ETH Amsterdam as well. If you're going to ETH Amsterdam, I'll see you. I'll see you there too if you happen to go.
Yeah, I still need to check my schedule, but we'll see. But yeah, thanks a lot.